Jesus says, "You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, coming with the clouds of heaven." The high priest tears his robes and shouts, "Blasphemy!" Hi, and welcome to The Amateur. I'm Justin. Here, we're going to be looking at some of the biggest ideas in the Bible, and to be honest, have a little bit of fun, digging a little deeper than sometimes people are used to. We'll also try to dust away some of those really common misconceptions you constantly hear about the Bible and Christianity on the internet these days. And in this video, we're going to look at one of the biggest of them all, because in the Gospels, something Jesus says causes people to try to stone him. One claim you'll often hear is that Jesus never actually said he was God. That belief, we're told, developed later. But when you start reading the Gospels carefully, something interesting begins to appear. The reactions. Again and again, people respond to Jesus' words as if he just made a divine claim. Sometimes the reaction is confusion, sometimes it's worship, and sometimes it's a death sentence. So, instead of beginning with theological debates, we're going to start with something simpler. The reactions. Because reactions usually tell you what people think they just heard. One of the clearest examples comes from a conversation recorded in the Gospel of John. Jesus is speaking with a group of religious leaders about Abraham. The discussion becomes heated, and then Jesus says something remarkable. "Before Abraham was, I am." The reaction is immediate. They pick up stones, which tells us two things. Firstly, they clearly understood the statement. Second, they understood the law. In the law of Moses, claiming the divine name for yourself was blasphemy, and blasphemy carried a very specific penalty: death. People don't try to execute someone over a confusing sentence. What Jesus said, they heard as a claim about God. But this isn't the only moment where Jesus' words provoked that kind of reaction. Later, during his trial, something even more dramatic happens. To understand it, we need to go back several centuries. The prophet Daniel records a vision in the book of Daniel. The courtroom of heaven, God seated on the throne, and then someone approaches. This time it isn't an angel, it's a human figure. Daniel describes one like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. Interestingly, clouds tend to be God's transport in the Old Testament. Daniel says this figure receives authority over every nation. Now fast forward to Jesus standing before the high priest. Jesus says, "You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, coming with the clouds of heaven." The high priest tears his robes and shouts, "Blasphemy!" He clearly didn't think Jesus was describing the weather. When Jesus claims Daniel's Son of Man, the high priest hears something far more than a title. But accusations of blasphemy aren't the only surprising reactions in the gospel. Accusations of blasphemy are one thing, but something else happens in the gospel that raises an equally interesting question. People begin worshipping Jesus, and in Jewish theology, worship belongs to God alone. Again and again in the Gospels, people fall down before Jesus, and something interesting happens. He doesn't stop them. Angels refuse worship in the scripture. Jesus doesn't. The Gospels repeatedly show Jesus receiving the same kind of honor normally reserved for God. And when you keep reading, another pattern begins to appear. As the story continues, another pattern begins to appear. Passages from the Old Testament that originally referred to the Lord start appearing in places where the New Testament is talking about Jesus. Sometimes the writers quote them directly, sometimes they simply apply the language. And the Psalms love him. Again and again, language that originally describes the Lord begins appearing in descriptions of Jesus, which raises an interesting question. Why would the earliest Christians feel comfortable doing that? Passages about Yahweh start appearing in places where the New Testament is describing Jesus. And interestingly, some of the strongest examples appear very early. The Gospel of Mark is widely considered the earliest written account of Jesus' life, and yet it contains some of the most dramatic reactions of all. Mark opens his Gospel by quoting a prophecy about the coming of the Lord, and then quietly applies it to Jesus, which is a fairly bold way to start a book. In other words, some of the strongest claims about Jesus' identity appear among the earliest Christians. Some of the strongest claims about Jesus appear among the earliest Christians, which brings us to one of the most famous moments in the entire New Testament. A disciple named Thomas finally sees the risen Jesus, and he says something remarkable. "My Lord and my God." Now, occasionally you hear people say this was just an exclamation, something like saying, "Oh my God." But that explanation runs into a few problems. For one thing, you simply don't find examples of people using God's name like this anywhere else in the scriptures. In the Bible, the divine name is treated with extraordinary seriousness. And then there's Jesus' response. He doesn't correct Thomas. In fact, he affirms the moment. "Because you have seen me, you have believed." If Thomas had taken God's name in vain, that would have been a strange response. And John, who wrote the gospel, clearly didn't think Thomas was swearing. By this point, something begins to emerge. There seems to be a pattern. Jesus either uses the divine name himself, or he doesn't stop people when they use it about him. And the Psalms love him, as I've already said. Thomas simply says out loud what the pattern has been pointing toward all along. So, if we take a step back and look at the reactions across the Gospels, something becomes difficult to ignore. People pick up stones when Jesus says, "Before Abraham was, I am." The high priest tears his robes when Jesus claims the Son of Man. People fall down and worship him, and Thomas looks at him and says, "My Lord and my God." And by this point, something becomes hard to miss. There seems to be a pattern. The people who heard Jesus speak clearly understood the claim. The only people who seem confused about it are modern readers. "You have heard the blasphemy," which explains the reactions. If you enjoy exploring the text like this, consider subscribing. There's a lot more to uncover. And if there's a passage you'd like to see examined next, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.